Hello there, everybody. My name is Tate Ankerbrandt. Thank you, Victor, and thanks to all of our presenters for being here. This has been such a unique and amazing conference. And yeah, I just wanted to reiterate, I appreciate everybody taking the time to look at these. We have some wonderful contestants and beautiful, beautiful presentations around psychedelic research. So today I would like to introduce a dear friend of mine, Brendan Caldwell. Brendan is a volunteer with DanceSafe and is the cohort above me at Naropa University studying transpersonal and mindfulness-based counseling. And today he's going to be talking about the opiate epidemic, which I think is a perfect segue into our next presentation. So thank you guys so much for being here again. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Brendan.
Thanks, Tate. Hello, everyone. Let me just get this all set up. I will actually be talking about the overdose epidemic. The difference between those will be made clear as we talk. Let's see here. Can everyone see my? Cool, great. Okay. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. Yeah, my topic is going to be about rethinking the overdose epidemic. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about the costs of prohibition, taking a critical look at the government's response to the overdose crisis. Okay, my name is Brendan. As Tate mentioned very briefly, I'm a harm reductionist. My background comes mostly in the form of music festivals, doing drug testing, psychedelic peer support, things along those lines. I also consider myself a harm reductionist in outlook, as will be hopefully clear throughout this presentation. My primary goals, the primary emphasis of my outlook is in helping people that use drugs stay alive as a first and foremost priority, because one cannot recover if they are dead. So yeah, harm reductionist, psychedelic assisted therapist in training. That's what I'm doing at Naropa along with Tate. Self-identified drugs nerd. And then also I have a business providing psychedelic consultations and coaching. And that's called the Trip Advisor with 2 Ps. You're welcome to visit that and see what you think. Okay, so just talk really quickly about where we are right now. Some of this was actually covered in the previous presentation, which is fantastic. So the first thing is that drug overdoses are now the leading cause of death for Americans age 18 to 45. Approximately 110,000 Americans died of a drug overdose in 2021. As far as leading cause of death, I do want to point out that that is above COVID-19 and car accidents for people age 18 to 45. We're seeing high potency adulterants showing up in the illicit drug supply. That's been getting worse and worse and worse. Fentanyl is only actually a pretty limited part of the equation now. It's getting much more complicated. The other thing to mention is that fake pharmaceuticals have flooded the illicit drug supply. I would love to show some pictures. I didn't include them, but it's important for people to know out there. So for instance, we're seeing fake oxycodones that are blue M30 pills that are just fentanyl. We're seeing a lot of Xanax on the street that's actually just fentanyl. Yeah, so that's also like a concern that's been getting worse. Okay, so here's the mainstream narrative. I kind of think of this as like the NPR narrative or the dope sick narrative or something along those lines. Just to cover it really quickly. So in 1998, Purdue Pharma develops and markets OxyContin as a less addictive opioid painkiller. In the early 2000s, opioid prescriptions increased dramatically, resulting in diversion and overdose. Diversion is a word that the DEA uses to mean that people who were not prescribed the medications are taking them. In 2010, the FDA drastically restricts doctors' abilities to prescribe, and the DEA starts going after doctors perceived to be overprescribing pill mills. Around 2014, fentanyl enters the black market drug supply, and this drastically increases black market overdoses. By 2019, there's widespread replacement of heroin with fentanyl in the illicit drug supply. Who's to blame in this mainstream narrative? Purdue Pharma for developing and marketing OxyContin, reckless doctors for prescribing more than they should have, the government for not cracking down sooner. The solutions generally are thought to be more aggressive efforts to criminalize manufacturers, distributors, and users of non-prescribed opioids or just drugs in general. As we'll see, this has become a lot more than opioids, but okay. So essentially what I'm going to be doing for the rest of this presentation is complicating this narrative and pointing out ways in which it is either like unnecessarily simplistic or actually just like biasing the perspective, like placing blame where it isn't actually warranted. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about Oxycontin and Oxycontin ending up on the market. So the whole story that I think we're all pretty familiar with at this point about Purdue Pharma lying and saying that Oxycontin was a less addictive version and all these things. This really didn't happen in a vacuum, right? So like an important question to ask is, so Purdue Pharma lied. Why would it be that medical doctors' primary information about the safety of these drugs is coming from for-profit companies? Like, why would that be, right? Because we can assume that pharma companies' primary incentive is to profit from drug development. Currently, more than 70% of clinical trials for new drugs are privately funded, and the majority of those results are never published. The company is able to essentially pick and choose between trials to minimize the side effects they have to report and all kinds of things like that. The FDA does review this data, but it generally defers to the pharma companies. First of all, Big Pharma puts an immense amount of money into hiring FDA employees to help them get around any regulatory hurdles. There is a revolving door between the FDA and people who are in positions of authority in the FDA and the pharmaceutical industry. Also, Big Pharma puts more money than any other industry, hundreds of millions of dollars into lobbying, which puts immense pressure on the FDA. Many people have observed that Big Pharma has greater power and influence than the FDA, which is supposed to be its regulatory agency. So due to political pressure, the FDA has increasingly shortened the amount of time needed to study a new drug before it gets to market. So for reference, in 1992, the mean review time was 2.8 years for a new drug application. By 2018, this has decreased to 7 months. Moreover, the actual evidence required for a new drug to be approved has also gotten more lax. So in 1990, new drugs generally needed 3 or more phase 3 human trials to be considered for approval. Nowadays, the majority of drugs approved by the FDA today involve fewer than 1,000 patient subjects in tests that last under 6 months. And this is all essentially because pharma is attempting to get things approved more quickly so that their patents last longer and they can make more money. Let's see. Also another little number here that's kind of interesting. The average number of human trials the FDA requires for a new drug to be approved has also fallen from over 3 in 1985 to just 1 today. So it's just gotten more and more lax. Interestingly, pharma companies are even allowed to market directly to doctors. Generally, the safety and efficacy information doctors have about the newest treatments are directly from pharma reps, none of whom are MDs. Independent reviews over the past 35 years have found that only 11 to 15% of newly approved drugs have significant clinical advantages over existing, better known drugs. And again, this is largely because pharma companies can only keep the patent for about 10 years after it gets approved, so they're constantly in need of a new drug to replace the generic with so they can maintain their patent and continue to make money. So this is just to say that it is true that Purdue Pharma lied, but I would argue that they were structurally incentivized to lie. We, as a society, have put a profit-driven company in a position to both profit from drugs and inform doctors, patients, and the FDA about the safety and effectiveness of those drugs. The behavior that people are suing over with Oxycontin is being done widely in the pharmaceutical industry. It just hasn't burned us in this exact same way for other things, or it hasn't been realized. So this is just to say I'm not a defender of big pharmaceuticals, but we've created a system in which for-profit companies are incentivized to lie and then given absolutely no actual regulatory effort to like make sure that they're telling the truth. Yeah, okay, next. So to complicate the talk about the rise in opioid prescriptions. So I think a large part of the mainstream narrative about the overdose crisis places an immense amount of blame on doctors specifically. And to some degree, I'm sure that there are instances in which this is justified, but I do want to give a little bit more context that I think helps us understand exactly what happened here. The first thing is that Western doctors have long used opioids for severe long-term pain management. This goes back at least as far as the Civil War and our like heavy use of morphine in battlefield injuries. Importantly, doctors were informed that new opioid pain relievers were less addictive due to their time delay formula. Again, the main source of information that doctors have for this and all kinds of other drugs and new treatments is actually the pharma reps and people who have like a financial incentive to tell them that this is the best new treatment, that you should only use this one, it's way better. There's also, interestingly, consistently, for whatever reason, doctors say that they're going to like pharma conventions and getting all this extra swag and all this other stuff doesn't influence their results. And research consistently shows that it does influence their decisions in prescribing. So doctors also underestimate the degree to which like their involvement in this for-profit healthcare system is like destroying their own ability to give quality healthcare to their patients. Importantly, so another important part of this is that pain as the fifth vital sign rose to prominence. And what I think is a very real need for better pain management was recognized. Whether this pain management should be done in the form of opioid medications can be debated, but it's also important to mention that even I agree with the pain as the fifth vital sign, like that is a relevant medical piece of information. But Big Pharma was hugely influential in funding the studies that eventually resulted in the shift to think of pain as a fifth vital sign that needed more treatment. And that is absolutely because Big Pharma is the one who's selling the painkillers. Okay, and then I will admit that some doctors certainly sold prescriptions for money, but the vast majority of prescriptions were certainly given in good faith. Okay, so this is some data that I've compiled. You can find it at the, what do they call that? The National Survey of Drug Use and Health. Hopefully that's still clear. This is specifically looking at national overdose deaths involving any opioid from 1999 to 2020. And so I'm just going to kind of look at sort of the mainstream narrative on top of this data set, if that makes any sense. So we'll see that the increase in opioid prescriptions starts in the late 90s, early 2000s, right around there. You can see that not that deaths are good at all, right? But we're hovering around 7,000 to 10,000 deaths a year of overdose deaths involving any opioid. So the government really starts being alerted to this and kind of mounting their response by putting pressure on doctors in about 2010. So users of these large opioid prescriptions they've been on them for like a decade are now left physically and often psychologically dependent on a class of substances they no longer have access to. We see pretty much widespread loss of these opioid prescriptions around 2012. That's like the transition period. About 2010 is when the FDA gets involved and they start to really get, even the DEA starts to arrest doctors, brings the war on drugs to doctors. And then most people are pushed off of their opioid prescriptions around 2012. So then the question becomes, obviously, access to pharmaceutical opioids is limited, but what about the demand for opioids in general, right? Like lots of these people are going to end up switching into the black market. How many people? It's totally unclear. I've tried, but have so far been unable to find reliable estimates on the total demand for opioids in the United States. I don't know if the demand for opioids fell even temporarily as a response to these policies of pushing everyone off their prescriptions. But as we can see, the overdoses kept rising. If the intention of these policies was to reduce the deaths of people who are using opioids, then clearly this policy had the exact opposite effect. You can see after 2012, the overdose rate exponentially skyrockets. Yeah, and this is largely attributed to pushing people onto illicit opioid sources where the overdose rate is significantly higher. I do have data about heroin users, and this is heroin use in the past year. That's what the word active is supposed to mean. So looking at 2010, it appears that these policies may have increased the demand for black market opioids such as heroin. And at the very least, it appears that the heroin market increased substantially following the loss of access to prescription opioids. Was not significantly interrupted. Something we'll talk about later that is like a little note at the bottom here. I don't want to just like distract people. The word heroin now is very fraught because heroin, which used to be diacetylmorphine, is no longer heroin in most of the United States. It's no longer possible to find diacetylmorphine easily on the street. It's pretty much all fentanyl and various other high potency analogs. But this is still tracking heroin, even in like 2019, 2020. Okay, so this is an overlay with that old chart, the overdose deaths involving any opioid, but I've overlaid on it a blue line, which is the overdose deaths involving prescription opioids, and then an orange line, which is overdose deaths involving synthetic opioids other than methadone, which is primarily fentanyl. So as you can see, fentanyl's entrance into black market opioids is clearly a large part of the overdose epidemic. Whoops. That little arrow you can see at about 2014 is when fentanyl overtook prescription pills in terms of driving opioid overdose deaths. So from this, I think it's pretty clear that the government has put enough pressure on the medical industry that availability of prescription opioids plateaued around 2012. But this had no effect on the opioid overdose rate. In fact, the overdose rate after this point skyrockets. Yeah, cool. Okay, quickly. So what is fentanyl? So fentanyl has been used in medicine since the 1960s, but found its current place in the US black market around 2006. It's high potency, so about 250 micrograms per adult is a dose. And it has a physical overdose profile, and those two things has made it a profoundly dangerous additive to street drugs. However, its high potency also meant the distributors could ship 10 times less of it for the same street value, as long as it was primarily used as a cut in heroin. So by 2019, fentanyl was the primary ingredient in nearly all street heroin, quote unquote, across the United States. Importantly, fentanyl was sold as heroin because of low street user demand, right? Like the people on the street in 2012 were not looking for fentanyl, right? So they had to sell it as heroin. Because the market is entirely unregulated for this drug, users don't have the information they need to avoid misidentification. Distributors and manufacturers, therefore, can change the actual contents of their products however they choose, so long as its effect is similar enough, right? So the users in a black market economy don't have the ability to say, oh, I don't want fentanyl, I want heroin, right? They just get what's available. And so distributors and manufacturers get to entirely dictate what happens to the drug market, and their primary motivating factor is just avoiding conviction and making money. Okay, so why is fentanyl in heroin? It's estimated about 95 to 96% of heroin actually is just fentanyl. As I mentioned earlier, it's no longer realistic to get diacetylmorphine heroin on the streets of any US city. Heroin is now a luxury good. So one thing to talk about here in terms of why is fentanyl in heroin, there's an interesting set of like research that was done back in the 70s or so, talking about the iron law of prohibition. The idea behind this is that the harder the enforcement, the harder the drugs will become. When drugs are prohibited, they will be produced in a black market in more concentrated and powerful forms, because these more potent forms offer better efficiency in the business model. So they take up less space and storage, less weight and transportation, and they sell for more money. Interestingly enough, they were not writing about the fentanyl problem when they first talked about the iron law of prohibition. They were writing about alcohol prohibition. And what we saw with alcohol prohibition is you get rid of alcohol and there's a sudden drop in use. And then within a couple of years, the demand comes way back, but there's no longer access to beer or wine because those are low potency drinks. Everything is moonshine, various aspects of hard liquor. And you're seeing people getting wood alcohol in their alcohol and dying. You're seeing people go blind, right? We're seeing all kinds of issues, and it's the exact same trajectory, right? Is that we made it illegal and therefore lost any ability to regulate the thing, right? And in order for people who are breaking the law to get the drug, alcohol, into the country more successfully, they're going to go to higher and higher potency versions, or even if they're not getting it into the country, even if they're cooking it in the country or making it in the country. they're going to want to make it more and more potent. And there's no regulation on what's in it, right? So sometimes people get seriously injured. So in the past 5 years, the Mexican drug cartels have gone all in on synthetics. That's methamphetamine and fentanyl primarily. And they pretty much entirely foregone plants. So that'd be like coca for cocaine and poppy for opium. They're not really dealing in that anymore. There's a couple reasons for this. So the DEA can more easily burn down a field of coca or poppy than find an underground lab. We have given the DEA unilateral rights to go into other countries and burn down entire fields of other people's products. And we've been successful enough at that we have now driven them underground into labs where they're just making high potency synthetics. Also, the potency of these chemicals allows them to make fewer and smaller shipments that are easier to get past law enforcement. There's also something to mention, and I'll talk about this a little bit later. There's also a global warming, like a climate change part of this, which is also kind of interesting. The environment, the habitat for certain plants, such as like large fields of poppies in Central and South America, has increasingly become untenable because of changes in the climate. So that's another reason that they're moving towards synthetics. Anyway, so as manufacturers provide cheap and plentiful product, distributors are going to use it, right? Like if they're going to get a hold of something that acts like heroin and it's cheaper than heroin, then they're going to sell it as heroin, right? Okay, and this is just, it looks insane. This is a map that's actually showing the ways that opium used to make it into the United States. This is from DEA sources. It's obviously all over the place. I'm going to try to make this a little bit clearer for people, just because I know it's all over the place. If you look into Southeast Asia, you'll see what we'll call, what's often called the Golden Triangle. And it's a series of opium producers that are shipping all over the world, but also to the United States. You can also see the Fertile Crescent, which is in like the Middle East region. It's Iran, Afghanistan. And then more importantly, you can see that in South America, we have some opium coming north to us and a lot of it going to Mexico City. And then from Mexico being distributed to many different cities inside the United States. And that's mostly the Mexican drug cartels. Now, the Mexican drug cartels are not responsible for all of the drugs that come to the United States, but about 60%, it's estimated, about 60% of the cocaine, opium, methamphetamine, such things are mostly making it to the United States through our southern border for the most part. So this whole map has kind of become outdated in the last 10 years. Most of these routes are still open, but they're transporting plants in higher demand, like coca or fentanyl, and have been enlisted in the manufacture and distribution of those various other things. So this is a quick transition to fentanyl and fentanyl precursors. It's various like moves to the United States, how it moves through the world actually. So in the late 2000s, fentanyl was coming into the US exclusively through the dark web and was primarily manufactured in China. I know the way this map is structured, going from China to the United States is really inconvenient, but it's on the far right side of the map is China, and you can see a lot of it's coming in through the coasts. In 2018, Trump made a deal with China to shut down all of its unlicensed fentanyl exports into the US. The Chinese government, however, did not aggressively enforce this, and a lot of fentanyl and fentanyl analogs were still getting through. However, it did put enough pressure on some Chinese manufacturers that they started selling their technology to other drug traffickers rather than the product itself. Biden's additional attempts to put pressure on China has furthered this move away from China as the primary source of fentanyl and its analogs towards the Mexican cartels. The Mexican cartels started getting into the game around 2013. Now they're pretty much exclusively on synthetics, as I mentioned. There is some trade with coca and opium that's still occurring, but the cartel's bread and butter really is fentanyl and methamphetamine at this point. Trump administration's move to pressure China to shut down fentanyl production was a huge boon to the cartels. It really helped them out. They bought the Chinese chemists and got increasingly good at making fentanyl. So no longer were there cooks out in the desert somewhere in the bush trying to make chemicals or make fentanyl with just loose, harsh chemicals. Now they have legit pharmaceutical grade labs that are operating underneath Mexico City and other major cities in Mexico. Okay, and then just real quick, so just to zoom in, as you can see from this map, Mexico is how most of the drugs get into this country. So the reason fentanyl is everywhere and heroin is scarce is largely due to a shift in their business practices. They have a major influence on what happens in the United States. Okay, so this is talk more generally, and this is why I wanted to say it's an overdose epidemic and not necessarily just an opioid epidemic. So the opioid epidemic has spilled over into the stimulant market. This is a graph looking at national overdose deaths involving cocaine. So as you can see, cocaine deaths were actually decreasing until fentanyl started showing up in heroin around 2014. And then suddenly we start to see accidental, or potentially not accidental, but cocaine being contaminated with fentanyl. In truth, it's important to note that we actually have a polysubstance overdose epidemic on our hands. Oftentimes when people end up having fatality from a drug overdose, several drugs are involved. It'll be a combination of downers often. So it'll be like alcohol and opiates, opiates and benzos, alcohol and benzos. There's lots of different possible choices. And it is also relatively unusual, especially amongst street users, for them only to use uppers or downers. A lot of people that are using heavily on the streets use both, depending on the situation. So that actually makes this data a little complicated. Since many stimulant users also use opioids, toxicology cannot tell if the user intended to ingest something or not. So it's possible that a number of these deaths may have been intentional combinations, right? So the person intended to smoke fentanyl and shoot methamphetamine, not that they accidentally got some fentanyl in their methamphetamine, but it's hard to know one way or the other. So that's just an important little asterisk to put on this particular piece of data. Okay, so why is fentanyl in everything else? My personal theory is accidental cross-contamination. Somewhere in the chain, likely domestic. It's likely not, and I don't think it's happening down in Mexico. The reason I don't think it's happening down in Mexico first is that they would face higher penalties for having a kilo of cocaine with 2 milligrams of fentanyl in it than they would for just a kilo of cocaine. And so it isn't really in there. There's no financial incentive for them to mix it across the border and then send it to the United States. Mostly this is probably happening at high levels of dealing domestically, right? So like wholesale product level. So someone is adding fentanyl to their dope, their heroin, intentionally because they're trying to essentially make their heroin seem stronger or seem like an opioid at all. And what they're doing is using the same supplies they cut their cocaine with. So for instance, oftentimes cocaine is cut with procaine. Procaine is a topical numbing agent. And so people think when they take cocaine and it has procaine in it, that it's higher quality because they can't feel their face. But it's just the procaine. So anyway, so when they're cutting their procaine into their cocaine, they're using the same tools, the same table, the same cards, the same gloves, maybe if they're using gloves, to cut that procaine into their cocaine. And as a result, tiny amounts of fentanyl end up in that cocaine. Now, this wouldn't normally be a problem if they were working with heroin, for instance, if they're cutting lactose into their heroin and then they use the same table to do that. It wouldn't necessarily be a problem because you'd have to get a lot of heroin into your one line of cocaine to cause an overdose the way that we see with fentanyl. But because fentanyl is so potent, only a small amount, like 2 milligrams, needs to be consumed accidentally for a user to overdose. So what I think what's happening is that we're getting an accidental contamination of a tiny little amount in the cocaine, somewhere higher up on the chain, and then it goes down the line to like various dealers and users until eventually some small group of people get like the hot bag, right? The bag that has enough fentanyl in it that some of those people are going to overdose. And then who overdoses in that group of people is going to just depend on who got more fentanyl in their batch in their particular line. Evidence that I see for this interpretation, as opposed to like the intentional contamination theory, is that patterns of overdoses from cocaine or other stimulants that are like fentanyl related tend to happen in these very small clusters. So I would, for instance, if someone's intentionally putting, let's say 1%, have their cocaine be 1% fentanyl, let's say they want to make a speedball or something, automatic speedball, you would probably see overdoses happening in a much more diverse way, right? Because everyone's getting some amount of fentanyl. Every once in a while, someone's getting more fentanyl they intended because it's not evenly distributed. And so you'd see like one person die here, one person die there, but it doesn't happen that way generally. It's happening in clusters, clusters of like 2, 3, 4, 5 people, right? And that suggests that what I was thinking, which is that they're essentially hitting a hot piece of this sample, right? Which isn't anywhere else in the sample, right? It's just a section of fentanyl somewhere in there that people are essentially running into by accident. Also, I don't really see the profit motive for intentionally cutting fentanyl into uppers. Fentanyl is obviously an opiate or opioid, and therefore a downer. Also, cocaine overdoses decrease demand temporarily, while heroin overdoses can increase demand temporarily, depending on the users. And one of the reasons for this is because dope has an overdose profile. When people on the other side of town start dying in higher numbers from the dope, there are people who use dope who think that must be stronger. I can spend the same $10 and then split that dose twice, or I can get more for my buck this way. And for a lot of people, especially those that are like seriously struggling with dependence, they're really just trying to stop from being sick, and they don't want to have to spend more money than they need to stop from being sick. So they're just trying to get what they need. So anyway, you don't really see that with cocaine though. Like people still certainly can overdose on cocaine, but you don't see them like falling out in the same way. And so generally when someone is selling cocaine and someone randomly dies of opioid overdose, that people who use that person's cocaine won't because they're afraid. So I don't really see any motive on the part of dealers. It's also important to mention that in these little clusters, often the immediate dealer, like the person who dealt to those 5 people, they also die, which I think is more evidence that this is happening on accidental, at least at the point of street dealers, right? There's a lot of hands from going from Mexico City to the United States. There's still a lot of hands any substance passes through before it gets in your body. So there's a lot of potential people who could have accidentally contaminated it. But I think a lot of it's probably happening before street level dealers, people that primarily deal to users rather than people who primarily deal to dealers. Okay. And again, fentanyl is in everything because the drugs are illegal, right? So like these drug dealers aren't using like good manufacturing practices or PPE when they're cutting their drugs and things like that. And we have, as users on a black market, have no ability to figure out what actually is in their drugs. We have testing, but it's very limited. Okay. And this I actually just added because I thought it would be interesting to talk about opioids specifically. I think that one thing that's interesting about opioids is they've really gotten a bad rap in the last couple of years. Opium, which is in many ways the original opioid, is one of the oldest plant medicines on earth. We've been using it beneficially in our lives for a very, very, very long time. No chemical is inherently evil, at least in my perspective. So it's just important to try to right size our understanding about opioids. There's a lot I could say on this topic. I'd be happy to talk about it more in the future. One thing I was curious about is how addictive opioids are, right? There's kind of a story that it's the most physically addicting chemical. Once you're hooked for life, like that sort of thing. So I found a couple of different research studies that were looking at heroin dependence. One of the more persuasive ones I found was actually a longitudinal study that was following people who had just started using heroin to see how many of them desisted and how many of them continued a year out and how many were classified as dependent or chaotic in their use a year out. This study estimated that heroin use leads to dependence 28 to 32% of the time in the status quo. And that's in a situation where heroin is kind of regarded as the last stop before death, like a quasi-suicidal activity. And as long as that's the case, a lot of the people who end up using this drug will already be in a very bad place before they end up getting there. So I think that 28 to 32% is a little bit high. relative to just like the drug itself versus like the drug interacting with our culture and policies surrounding how the drug exists in our society. But I just think that's really interesting. I think for a lot of people, that's way lower than they thought it would be. And looking at all the various illegal drugs, this is still the highest, right? Like on like the scale between LSD and heroin, like heroin is still like really high on there in terms of like rates of dependence. And it's still a minority of people who consume the thing, about a third. I mentioned this a couple times, but it's just so fascinating. And it's important to know that you really can't find heroin widely in the United States. It's a luxury good. It's something that, you know, white kids get in the suburbs because they only want to smoke the heroin or something along those lines. Most people, street users, right, like people that are like copping on the street, it's just fentanyl, and they know it's just fentanyl. A lot of them don't bother to do the tests, like the fentanyl strip test, because they know that there's probably fentanyl in there. A lot of people are addicted specifically to fentanyl, right? And if you try to replace their fentanyl addiction with anything else, even like Dilaudid or buprenorphine or methadone, it doesn't replace as well as if they were addicted to heroin. And that's something that's just in the past now. Someone who's primarily physically dependent on heroin is a very hard person to find these days. Generally, street users are addicted to fentanyl and anything else that's in their dope on a regular basis. Okay. Let's see. That's also important to know from medication-assisted therapy. I think that in certain ways, we're like way out of date with our understanding of like what's going to work and what's not going to work. The success rates, for instance, for methadone clinics for people that are addicted to fentanyl are way lower than they are for heroin. Okay. This is another thing that I wanted to talk about really quickly. So to talk about how it's not just fentanyl anymore, we are seeing lots of other things in the dope in the United States. Generally, dope is the first place that things get adulterated. It has the most dependent using population with the least amount of autonomy and agency and the most amount of oppression and marginalization. So as a result of those things, like oftentimes the most adulterated street drugs are dope. But as we can see with fentanyl, oftentimes what's getting cut into dope is sort of a signal for what we might see in other street drugs later. So like first we saw fentanyl and heroin in 2014. By 2019, it's in a significant amount of cocaine. We're seeing it sometimes in ketamine. We're seeing it sometimes in MDMA. Okay, so this is just to say, even if you don't use opioids and you don't consider yourself tied up with the oppression and freedom of people who use opioids, it's still your problem. Okay, so on the East Coast, we're seeing what's often being called trank dope. It's being cut with xylazine, so it'll be fentanyl and xylazine. Xylazine is an animal tranquilizer. It's primarily used with large animals, elephants, whatnot. It works very similarly to ketamine. It's an NMDA receptor antagonist. However, it is much, much, much more potent. It also has never been, what would you call it, certified for use in humans. There's a issue with xylazine, which I'm not sure we have any understanding of why it's happening yet. But it's causing essentially like necrosis at the site of injection for a lot of people, especially if they're muscle popping their injections, meaning that they're not putting it in the vein, they're putting it like intramuscularly. We're seeing, these like sores developing that we think is a result of the xylazine specifically, and we're not really sure why. Trank dope has spread pretty quickly across the United States. We're definitely seeing trank dope in Denver. I'm speaking to you from Colorado. We're pretty much seeing it everywhere in the United States to a certain degree. It is still worse on the East Coast, specifically West Virginia, Philadelphia, areas like that, where it's pretty much everywhere. It's like 95+% of dope is actually trank dope. More recently, in the last year or so, we're seeing a significant rise in what's called benzodope on the West Coast. Specifically, it started in Vancouver. Initially, I mean, it's still kind of the specific benzo varies pretty widely. There has been just like regular benzos like Ativan or Klonopin or things like that are getting cut into the dope. But the one of the ones that's more concerning. So there's a drug that's been around for quite a long time called Atizolam. It's a high potency benzo-like drug. I think it might actually still be considered a benzodiazepine. A lot of the high potency benzo analogs that we're seeing in benzodope are actually analogs of Atizolam. And so right now, the biggest one that's causing the most deaths, from what I can tell, in Vancouver and on the West Coast, is a drug called clonazepam, as opposed to clonazepam. It's clonazepam, and it's a high potency analog of Atizolam. That one, I actually don't know where we've got on spread yet. It's high frequency enough in Vancouver that it's certainly going to go other places. It probably already has. I haven't been hearing a lot of reports of it in like Colorado, for instance. But again, it's only a matter of time. Okay. And it's actually just important to like mention. So in terms of like trying to like test our way out of this issue or something like that, like there isn't any way that we as like harm reductionists can keep up with this, right? Like, for instance, we have immunoassay strips, like test strips that can identify benzos, right? So you would hope, oh, I can test my dope for benzos and I can know if it's benzodope. But all of the Atizolam analogs don't react to the existing benzodiazepine immunoassay strips. And so no, you can't, right? And like the for-profit black market will always be more evolving faster than we on the other side can try to protect people from what's happening. Testing is not a way out of the situation. Testing is something that is important and life-saving and ultimately palliative care for the overdose crisis that we're currently inside of. Okay. I just like this quote. I think about this quote a lot when I'm talking about drugs and drug policy. Every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. I think a lot about that with, for instance, the way that we set up Purdue Pharma for big pharmaceuticals and the FDA, right? Like, I think a lot of people could have told you that if you set it up that way, that if the only people who had the ability to really decide what drugs should be used for what and how safe they are for-profit industry. And that for-profit industry is allowed to market directly to doctors and to consumers for those medications, that would have eventually resulted in something very negative. Every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. Another example of that, the story that the government says for the overdose epidemic is that like doctors gave out too many opioid prescriptions and then people got hooked on the most addictive substance in the world and now people are dying at rapid rates. They importantly exclude the fact that people were not dying the way that they're dying now until they cut everyone off of their pharmaceutical opioid prescriptions, right? The story is the doctors did this, when the truth is we're talking about deaths. It's very clear that the DEA and the FDA did this along with various aspects of our prohibitionist government, including very much Joe Biden. For the record. Okay, so my perspective, who's to blame? There's lots of people to blame. DEA, FDA, capitalism, for-profit healthcare, deregulation of the pharmaceutical industry, for-profit politics, Richard Nixon, Joe Biden, Purdue Pharma, take your pick. Solutions. This will be interesting if everyone wants to talk about this later in the Q&A. From a harm reduction perspective, one of the best things that we've seen is free and open access to pure and accurately dosed drugs with offerings to use those at safe consumption sites. I think this is most important to do for the quote unquote hard drugs, that they be available for free and that they be available widely with as few barriers as possible to obtaining them. The reason being that the only way we can eliminate users from a black market is to make the white market that much more appealing than the black market. As long as users get barriers, right? Like if we say you can have this like prescription grade heroin, but only if you get a doctor's note and the doctor like puts you through all these various things. Lots of users will drop out of that and just go back to the street drugs, right? And then they will end up overdosing at significantly higher rates. So if the goal is to try to reduce the amount of death and carnage that's as a result of our drug policies, then I think that the best solution we have is something along the lines of like free and open access. Some examples of places that things like this have happened. So you have a really, really long-term project going on in Switzerland. There's one in Germany, Denmark. A lot of those, because they have socialized medicine, they're able to provide like doctors as gatekeepers with less of a problem than we would in a for-profit healthcare system like the US. Also, it's important to note in the United States especially, doctors are some of the most prohibitionist people that I have come across in doing the harm reduction work that I've been doing. I'm sure this isn't universally true. But part of bringing the war on drugs to doctors has really put like the fear in doctors that they could at any point lose their ability to practice medicine by giving people access to these things. And so in places in the United States where we've had, not even in the United States, in places in North America where we've had policies around like, let's say, prescription heroin programs, generally not nearly enough people get access that way. So it doesn't really make an impact or a dent on the overdose rates. But also you'll end up in a lot of situations with doctors that just refuse to participate in the program, even if the government says like, we need to start doing this. And you can see that, for instance, in Vancouver. Vancouver has some really interesting stuff going on in terms of safe supply and harm reduction. But all of it's very small in its outlook right now because they're limited in what they're allowed to do. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. I said at the end, fuck the police, carry Narcan, hashtag free Russ Ulrich. I'm open to any questions. I hear at the very end here, just thank you. Here's my email for my psychedelic consulting practice, the TripAdvisor at protonmail.com. I pretty much just provide a service where I help people do their drugs better or with more education. And that's all I got. Thank you, everyone.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Brendan. Really appreciate you being here and highlighting some really important stuff. I just wanted to open up the last about 10 minutes here for any questions from the audience. I'm sure Brendan would be more than happy to get into some discussion with you guys. Give it a couple minutes here.
Craig has his hand up, so I'm just going to allow him to talk.
Thanks, Vivek.
Hi, Brendan. That was incredibly thorough and interesting look at the, prohibition, I guess. And the first thing that came to mind, or one of the first things, is when you started talking about Biden and his intervention and the kind of untold, the sort of unforeseen, you may have foreseen the consequences, but maybe the government doesn't foresee these kind of consequences. And it always leads me to this question, which is, when has the government, and I speak broadly about governments, ever gotten drugs right in terms of prohibition or not prohibition? My feeling is regulatory bodies and government have never succeeded on this front in any capacity. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a profound question as to whether the government's ever succeeded. I mean, I can't think off the top of my head of anything I would point to where it's like, this is the solution, this is the best way to go. There's quite a few examples of governments that are trying something different, which that to me is the biggest thing. So when we ask about whether governments like foresee these outcomes, I think we're past that, right? Like we had 50 years of like seeing how these policies work out, right? And so like if there are people in government who are like, oh, we didn't realize that if we cut everyone off their opioid prescriptions that we'd explode the street market opioid problem. Those people are either like willfully naive or they're just not truthful in saying that they don't know that outcome. I think what's happening more is that they don't want to be seen as responsible. It would be worse, in the government's mind, it would be worse if 10,000 people a year were dying from prescription opioids than if 110,000 people a year were dying from opioids that they didn't prescribe. I think that's sick. But I don't really, that to me seems to be the motivation here. Certainly that's the outcome of the policies that they put in place. In terms of more effective solutions, so you have Portugal. Portugal is like a great example. We point to it all the time. There's lots of things wrong with Portugal as well, right? Like decrim is very limited in its ability to provide safe supply, right? Because the manufacturers and distributors are still breaking the law. And so you're still running into like lots of contamination in the drug supply. The big thing that Portugal did that I think was a really smart move to put on top of decrim was they started to create these large state-run testing sites where you can bring any sample of any drug and then come back 30 minutes later and they'll give you like a GCMS output for what's in that substance. that has significantly improved. It took many years to get street users to go into a government sanctioned site and do that, right? But slowly over the years, we've seen a very gradual improvement in the quality of drugs in Portugal, which is probably a result of increased user knowledge in the actual like drug supply. So, and then we have things like Switzerland, which are providing like free prescription heroin to like anyone who's currently addicted to opioids, which includes take-home doses if you've worked with them for enough years. Like it's pretty amazing. Like our attitude about what is feasible and not the end of the world when it comes to opioids is really, really, has been informed by a lot of anti-scientific bias and propaganda.
Great answer. Thank you very much again for the talk and for your answer.
Yeah, thank you. And racism. Yep. I didn't even get into the social justice component of this whole situation.
And I actually have a question myself on this. Do you think that, you know, like the way that opiates were irresponsibly prescribed, I guess like at the early points, like do you think that same profit incentive marketing to doctors encouraging prescriptions of these compounds, that, you know, same thing I guess could happen with psychedelic compounds, even once we get into like medical access is across like great, and every psychedelic you can imagine you can have clinical access, that we can run to the same thing, which is just like incentivization to perhaps recommend psychedelics to people that don't need it. And sure, it might not have the same, the outcome won't look the same as you know, the opioid epidemic, but it will be some sort of a health issue with, you know, the misprescription of this due to the financial incentives.
Definitely. So there's a lot of things I could say on that. I really appreciate the question. One of the things, I'm not like a policy person. There's a lot of complicated stuff with policy. One of the things I really worry about when I say that we should legalize drugs, because make no mistakes, I'm saying that we should legalize drugs, that one of the issues becomes the presence of for-profit organizations, right? So like, for instance, if heroin can be legally manufactured, distributed, right? It's fully possible that Bayer, who had the original patent for heroin, will just go back to direct-to-consumer marketing. Like we're going to see stuff on our cell phones about like the magical solutions that heroin provides, et cetera, right? And that does make me uncomfortable, because I think our current ability to advertise and regulate those for-profit companies is like really not good, and their technology around advertising has gotten increasingly good at overwhelming consent, like our consent. Like we no longer can make good judgments about the pros and cons of various actions because the marketing is really good. I think that we're already seeing that happen with psychedelics, and some of it is the market incentive, right? So like if Compass Pathways wants to have some sort of patent on like a lysergamide or some specific LSD treatment or whatever, they're gonna have marketing, if they're allowed to, that says that this is a panacea, it cures everything, no matter who you are, it's going to be great, just take this thing. You know, we're seeing that with ketamine right now, for instance. Yes, mind bloom. Yep, we're seeing that with ketamine in a big way, right? Where we have people that think that ketamine is a harmless substance because there's all these like advertisements that's like, it'll cure your depression, it'll cure your chronic pain, like just take this thing, it'll fix everything. Yeah, weed a decade ago, right? Like it's this sort of like panacea thing where, and some of it in like the psychedelic community, I think a lot of it is a manifestation of our own oppression, right? So like we are trying to be legitimized in like a larger sense, right? And so we, in many ways, are like overselling what we have available to try to like get a seat at the table. That will definitely get worse when there's companies that have financial incentives, and we have the same structure we currently have around marketing directly to consumers, right? Like saying whatever they want. The really problematic one, honestly, is the fact that so many doctors are informed about new drugs through pharmaceutical companies and pharmaceutical reps. Certainly when there's more research farther down the line, they'll know more, but that publicly funded research doesn't happen until drugs have been in the communities for like a decade or more. And we only bother to do that research, that post-market research, when people are obviously getting seriously injured by those drugs. So I do think that's a concern. And I think in our community, like something we can do as a psychedelic community is less of like the solution to everything is psychedelics. Like everyone should take these things. It's a magic pill.
type of thing.
Awesome, thank you. And yeah, no, thank you for coming and delivering this closing keynote for our Culture, Law, and Media Day. And yeah, if there's anything else you want to say to close us off, we'll be transitioning to our Q&A, but thank you so much.
Great, thank you. I just to answer as a question in the Q&A, it says, do you think legalization without allowing commercialization could be a policy solution? I think that something like that might actually be what we look at, like something like how nicotine and tobacco is currently treated, where the advertisements are allowed in a limited capacity, and not without disclaimers and things, but who knows? And thank you, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming in, Brendan.